Hi, this is History with me, Dan. This postcard shows a view of St. Francis Hospital in the Asylum Hill neighborhood of Hartford, Connecticut in about 1910. The view of the same area today reveals that those early hospital buildings are gone, replaced by more modern structures. In this video, I'm going to talk about the history of these earliest buildings, discussing what survives from the early days, what has been lost, and what has replaced them. Today, the hospital covers a large area between Woodland Street on the west, Atwood Street on the east, Ashley Street on the north, and Asylum Avenue on the south, with additional buildings in the vicinity. The oldest core of the hospital complex is located along Collins, Woodland, and Ashley Streets. I'll start by focusing on this area where buildings were erected from the start of the 20th century through the early 1960s. Then I'll talk about the large insurance company building on Asylum Avenue that was built in 1940-41 and was acquired by the hospital in the 1970s. I'll end the video by briefly noting the hospital's major new additions since the 1970s. In August of 1897, Mother Anne Valencia led a small group of French and American nuns of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Chambéry to Hartford to take charge of a new Catholic hospital. The hospital, named for its patron, St. Francis de Sales, was founded by the Most Reverend Michael Tierney, the 6th Bishop of Hartford. St. Francis was the first Catholic hospital sponsored by the Diocese of Hartford, and the first in the state of Connecticut. The sisters arrived expecting to find a fully equipped facility. It turned out that the hospital was located in a 3-story house owned by the diocese and once used as the bishop's residence. The house stood at the corner of Woodland and Collins Streets in the city's Asylum Hill neighborhood, shown here in a section of the 1896 Atlas of Hartford. The house's conversion into a hospital was not yet complete when the sisters arrived, and only 2 rooms were finished. There was also hostility from local residents over having a hospital feared as a place of disease in the neighborhood. Undaunted, the sisters quickly got to work and 2 days later received their first patient. The new hospital was not the only Catholic institution established by Bishop Tierney on Collins Street in 1897. Just a few doors down from the hospital was the original home of St. Thomas Seminary, which opened in a substantial brick school building that already had a distinguished educational history. It was built in 1874 to be the headquarters of the Chinese Education Mission, a program sponsored by the Chinese government, which brought students from China to New England to receive a Western-style education. The mission was organized by Young Wing, a graduate of Yale who wanted Chinese students to receive training in Western science and engineering. Chinese concerns about the Americanization of the students and a breach by the U.S. of the 1868 Burlingame Treaty with China led to the end of the mission in 1881. The building was later used as a college preparatory school for boys before becoming home to St. Thomas Seminary. Both the hospital and the seminary would soon expand. On January 29, 1901, St. Francis Hospital opened a new 4-story, 52-bed wing along Collins Street to the rear of its original Woodland Street building. This photograph shows the Italianate-style house, and behind it the new building, which was designed by the architectural firm of McGinnis, Walsh, and Sullivan of Boston. 5 years later, the hospital had expanded again, further east on Collins Street, with another new wing that opened in March of 1906. This postcard shows both additions, the 1901 one on the left and the 1906 one, designed by Hartford architect John J. Dwyer, on the right. The 1906 wing, which now became the hospital's main building, included such new features as a maternity ward, an emergency room, a morgue, and an X-ray room. The 1901 and 1906 buildings are shown here in a section of the Hartford Atlas of 1909. Just next door was the old Chinese mission building, and next to it, St. Thomas Seminary's new building, which was dedicated on August 15, 1901. To make way for this building, a house that had been on this lot was turned around and then moved north to a new address on Ashley Street. The new building on Collins Street would remain the seminary's home until 1930, when it moved to its current building in Bloomfield. Returning to the hospital, this section, from the 1920 Sanborn Atlas of Hartford, shows its further expansion. In 1910, Hartford's new bishop, John J. Nyland, acquired the Johnson property just to the north. The nurses' quarters and children's ward were moved here. During the next few years, additional properties were acquired in the neighborhood to serve the hospital's growing needs. As the years went by, almost all the rest of the houses on Ashley, Collins, and Atwood streets in the vicinity would become nurses' homes as well. Besides these properties, the hospital was continuing to expand north towards Ashley Street, extending from the 1906 addition. The structure known as Building Number 3 was built in stages, starting in 1913 to 14, with the basement dining and kitchen facilities. The upper levels, with additional private rooms, ward space, operating rooms, and laboratory, were built in 1916. Adjacent to this was a structure that contained the hospital's boiler, laundry, and ice plant. Building number 4, the final section, finished in 1920, completed the connection all the way to Ashley Street, as shown here in the Sanborn Hartford Atlas of 1922. By this time, the former Chinese mission building was also being used as a nurse's residence. A decade later, after the seminary moved to Bloomfield, its former building was also remodeled to become a nurse's home with a new auditorium wing. As I'll describe in a moment, the hospital's original buildings along Collins Street would eventually be replaced, so I believe the oldest surviving sections of the original complex are those 1916 and 1920 buildings. This is a recent photo of the 1920 building on Ashley Street, which is now connected to another building via a bridge above the street. Just to the west is the McAuliffe Memorial Pavilion, built in 1949 to 51. This is another view of the 1916 building, with the current entrance to the emergency department just east of it. Returning to the 1920 Atlas, the first of the original buildings to be torn down was the hospital's very first, the Italianate-style house. After 1906, it had been used as housing for interns and orderlies, but by 1932, it had long been considered unsafe. After 2 fires in 4 months that year, the house was razed due to safety concerns. In January 1937, St. Francis Hospital announced that it would be erecting a new wing which, as the Hartford Courant newspaper described it, would essentially be a memorial to Mother Valencia, superintendent of the hospital since its founding, who had passed away the previous November. Ultimately, as the Current reported that August, the building would be called the Dillon Memorial and would be the first hospital building in the city devoted exclusively to children. Built along Woodland Street and connected in the rear to the 1916 wing, the building was a gift of Miss Catherine H. Dillon in memory of her brothers, Charles Dillon and Edward H. Dillon. Shown here in a recent photo, the three-story building, which is now connected to more recent structures, was dedicated in 1939. It was designed by architect Lewis A. Walsh of Waterbury, who also designed St. Thomas's Seminary in Bloomfield, which I mentioned earlier. The building's fourth floor was added in 1950. The next major hospital building to be erected in 1940 to 41 was the St. Maurice Convent on Ashley Street. For the first time, all of the sisters could live here under the same roof. The Colonial Revival-style convent, designed by John J. McMahon of Hartford, would remain in use until 1993. It was demolished in 1997 and replaced with a parking lot. In 1949 to 51, the next major wing was erected at the cost of $2 million at the southwest corner of Woodland and Ashley Streets. It connected to the Dillon Memorial to the south. Called the Bishop McAuliffe Memorial Lying-In Pavilion, it became the hospital's new maternity and gynecological wing. This is a recent photograph of the building, and this postcard shows a 1950s view of the hospital buildings along Woodland Street, with the Dillon Memorial on the right and the McAuliffe Memorial on the left. Further additions in the 1950s were a new cafeteria behind the Dillon Memorial in 1953 and the cardiovascular laboratory building in the center of the hospital complex in 1957. The next major addition also extended towards Woodland Street from the earlier row of buildings constructed in 1906 to 1920. The 8-story Archbishop Henry J. O'Brien building was a modern structure dedicated in 1961. Just to the south, along Collins Street, was the hospital's then oldest surviving building. Erected in 1901, it had recently been serving as the main entrance to the emergency department. After the O'Brien building was completed, it was demolished and replaced by a new one-story emergency wing. This wing is now the Comprehensive Women's Health Center. In 1967, the old brick buildings just to the east were demolished. These included the old Chinese Education Mission and St. Thomas Seminary buildings, which had most recently housed the hospital's nursing school. The nursing school was moved to the Bond Hotel building on Asylum Street, which was renamed DeSales Hall. The school would remain there until it returned to the hospital in 1990. It eventually closed in 1997. As for the old buildings on Collins Street, they were replaced by the 8-story McGovern Pavilion, which opened in 1972. The hospital's next big addition in the mid-1970s would not be a new building, but one that had already been around for 35 years at that point. This is a section from the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. It depicts the old buildings on Collins Street that I described earlier in this video, the Bishop's House that became St. Francis Hospital's first home, and the Chinese Education Mission building that became St. Thomas Seminary's first home. By 1972, The hospital complex would occupy a large block here east of Woodland and north of Collins. Its next addition would be south of Collins Street, extending all the way to Asylum Avenue. Back in 1877, this was a residential area. A notable residence here, in the center of the block, was an Italian villa-style house built in 1854 by Erastus Collins, a dry goods merchant. It had the address of 1010 Asylum Avenue, but was set well back from the street on a large property that also had frontage on Atwood Street and included a number of outbuildings. The house was later the home of Erastus's son, Atwood Collins. Born in 1851, Atwood Collins was a businessman who became president of the Security Trust Company. Over his long career, he was associated with numerous Hartford banks and insurance companies, and, like his father before him, he served as president of the American School for the Deaf. He passed away in 1926, and after the death of his widow, the house on Asylum Avenue continued as the residence of his daughter, Emily Collins Scranton, shown here on the left in 1915. This is a picture of the Collins carriage house. Behind it, in the distance, is the spire of the 1901 St. Thomas Seminary building on Collins Street, which, as I mentioned before, later served St. Francis Hospital as part of the School of Nursing, and was torn down in 1967. This picture of the carriage house and this one of the main Collins house were taken in 1940, just before these buildings were torn down to make way for the new headquarters of the National Fire Insurance Company, which acquired the large block bound by Asylum Avenue on the south, Collins Street on the north, Atwood Street on the east, and Woodland Street on the west. This section from the Hartford Atlas of 1917 shows the location of the Atwood Collins house within that area. Adjacent to the Collins house for many years was the Samuel G. Dunham House at 1030 Asylum Avenue. It was built in the late 1880s or early 1890s. Samuel G. Dunham had established the Hartford Electric Light Company with his older brother Austin C. Dunham, and he'd become head of the company after his brother's death in 1918. Samuel had 6 children. The oldest of his 5 daughters was Dr. Ethel Collins Dunham, who became prominent in the field of pediatrics. When Samuel died in 1934, the property was inherited by his second daughter, Alice Elizabeth Dunham. The following year, she replaced the old family house with a new colonial revival-style residence. But just 5 years later, the new house was torn down for the insurance building. Undaunted, Alice E. Dunham relocated to what had been an apple orchard at 111 Terry Road and hired Smith and Bezette, the same architects who designed her Asylum Avenue house, to duplicate it on Terry Road. There were minor tweaks, most notably, the original house's 1-car garage was expanded to 2 cars. The whitewashed brick colonial revival house still survives today. Getting back to the National Fire Insurance Company, since 1893, its office had been in a building at the corner of Pearl and Lewis Streets in downtown Hartford. Seriously in need of more space, the company had contemplated moving to West Hartford, but was prevailed upon by Mayor Thomas J. Spalacy to remain in the city. And so, like the Hartford and Aetna insurance companies before them, the National Fire Insurance Company moved to the Asylum Hill neighborhood, erecting in 1940-41 the massive E-shaped structure with copper roof at 1000 Asylum Avenue. Occupying a 26-acre property, the $2 million building was designed by Eggers and Higgins of New York and was intended by its planners to resemble more a library or art museum than an office building. It was constructed of Rockwood, Alabama limestone above a granite base. The windows of the lowest floor are screened behind a low wall. In 1965, the building was acquired by Security Insurance Group, which moved its home office here from its previous bases of operation in New Haven, Connecticut, and Baltimore, Maryland. The head of the company was E. Clayton Gengras, one of Connecticut's wealthiest businessmen and philanthropists. A decade later, in 1975, St. Francis Hospital acquired the insurance building for $4,250,000, adapted by architect Thomas Monroe Nichols to house the hospital's outpatient clinics and physicians' offices. The building was renamed the Gengras Center in honor of E. Clayton Gengras, who was a board member and benefactor of the hospital. A bridge was erected above Collins Street to connect the building to the rest of the complex. Security Insurance continued to lease part of the building for a time, eventually moving to a new headquarters in Farmington in 1980. I'll briefly mention the hospital's major additions since then. 2 decades later, in 1996, the 10-story Patient Care Tower was dedicated. It connects above Collins Street to the hospital's earlier buildings to the north, and on the south has a similar connection to the former insurance company building. This is a westward view of the rear of the tower, showing how it connects to the Gengras building on the left and to the buildings on Collins Street to the right. With its symmetrical facade, the Patient Care Tower now serves as the main entrance to the hospital. 15 years later, in 2011, the 10-story John T. O'Connell Tower opened, a gift of Nancy and Daniel O'Connell in memory of their son. The building is located north of the 1972 McGovern Pavilion and east of the older wings along Woodland Street. As I mentioned earlier, it faces Ashley Street and has the entrance to the emergency department. The most recent construction project at the hospital, nearing completion as I'm making this video, is a new parking garage located just east of the Patient Care Tower. It replaced an earlier garage on this site that was demolished in 2022. This photo is a view from a window in the O'Connell Tower towards the ridge of Prospect Street to the west. Below, it overlooks the oldest surviving buildings of the hospital's interconnected complex. In the foreground is the roof of the 1916 building. Extending out from it toward Woodland Street is the 1939 Dillon Memorial. Remember that the Dillon Memorial's 4th floor was added in 1950, at the same time the McAuliffe Pavilion, the building just north of it along Woodland, was under construction. East of the McAuliffe Pavilion is Building 4, the 1920 wing, which is connected on its south end to Building 3, the 1916 wing, and on its north end faces Ashley Street. This view from Ashley Street shows the McAuliffe Pavilion on the right, the 1916 wing on the left, and the rear section of the Dillon Memorial in the distance. I hope you enjoyed this video about the early buildings of St. Francis Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. Please consider checking out my video about the lost buildings of Hartford Hospital. And thanks for watching.